So we wrote this book because we wanted to seek to try to explain how we went from Parkinson's disease being a very, very rare condition in 1817 when Dr. James Parkinson described it, to now the world's fastest growing brain condition. So in 200 years, we went from a condition that Dr. Parkinson said had never been classified in the medical literature and thus very rare to one that's exceedingly common. And we wrote this book to try to seek to explain why that might have happened and then outline what we can do, a PACT, P-A-C-T, to help prevent and end Parkinson's. So I'm going to share my screen here. And I think you can all see my screen. Is that right, Alistair? Good, perfect. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what an epidemiologist says that we're living in an age of degenerative and man-made diseases. Talk a little bit about the rise of Parkinson's disease and then about ending it. So a really smart French-American environmentalist, René Dubos, wrote in 1959, The Mirage of Health. And in it, he said that every civilization has its own kind of pestilence and can control it only by reforming itself. Said in simpler language, every society creates its own diseases. And we see those diseases around us wherever we go. And they've been around with us throughout the history of humans. A really smart epidemiologist, Dr. Abdul Omran, in 1971, sought to try to explain human population growth. And he divided human history, the 200,000 years that Homo sapiens have been on the earth, plus or minus, into 4 periods. In the first period, he said that early humans died of pestilence and famine. Quite simply, there wasn't enough food. Second period, beginning around 10,000 years ago with the agrarian revolution, was the first time we could store food and enable population growth. And this population growth led to the formation of cities. And these cities were breeding grounds for infectious pandemics, whether that's the bubonic plague in the 1400s, or the influenza pandemic in 1918, or hundreds of other pandemics in between. And then maybe, Natalie, can we mute? I think someone's got a phone call. I don't know if we can, let me see. No?
Yeah.
Okay.
They heard you. So that's good.
Well, I'll continue on it. Can you still hear me okay?
Yes.
We can.
Great. And then the third period was, he said, which we live in today, is an age of degenerative and man-made diseases. So if you think about cardiovascular disease, certainly degenerative and to a large extent man-made, you know, choices that we make in terms of smoking and not smoking, choices that we make in terms of the air that we breathe as a society. Other ones like car accidents, for example, are almost self-evident. And then the future, he said that we're going to die of delayed degenerative diseases and diseases born out of hubris. He called it hybristic infections. And it's quite concerning, I think, in this setting of the COVID-19 pandemic, that we still don't know exactly how this novel coronavirus was introduced into humans. And we should make sure that we're not breeding these new viruses ourselves. But I'm going to talk to you about degenerative and man-made diseases. The poster child for degenerative man-made diseases is lung cancer. So if you look at this graph and you look at the black line, it's lung cancer deaths in the United States. And if you look in the early 1900s, lung cancer deaths in the United States almost did not exist. There were almost none. And the reason we have lung cancer in the United States and around the world, the number one reason is smoking. So you can see that cigarettes were first introduced in the United States in about 1900s. And about 25 years after we started smoking, we started developing lung cancer. Almost beautiful parallel graphs. And when we stopped smoking in the 1960s and 1970s, when we put warnings on cigarettes, when we made it socially unacceptable instead of socially desirable to smoke, when we started adding taxes to cigarettes, smoking decreased, and with the decrease in smoking, 25 years came a decrease in lung cancer deaths. Indeed, in the early 1900s or late 19th century, before the advent of cigarettes, doctors took special notice when confronted with a case, thinking it a once-in-a-lifetime oddity. Well, what does this mean for Parkinson's disease? I'm going to jump to this. So what was going on when Dr. Parkinson, who was 61 at the time, a physician who'd been practicing medicine for 30 some years and the son of a physician, wrote his essay on the shaking palsy. I don't think it's a coincidence that the paper was written in 1817 in London, because that was the height of the Industrial Revolution, and London and England were the capital of that Industrial Revolution. And one of the major, since that time, numerous products and byproducts of the Industrial Revolution have been linked to Parkinson's disease. And one of the most common ones is air pollution. And the London fog had a little bit to do with weather, but a lot to do with air pollution. And the London fog is depicted here in 1847, looks a lot like modern day Beijing. The family there on the right each member is covering their mouths to avoid the toxic and harmful effects of the air pollution. They need boys with lanterns, torches, so they can walk the streets of London, because the smog was so thick you couldn't even see across the street. And since in other industrial products, especially pesticides, certain pesticides and industrial solvents and heavy metals have all been linked to Parkinson's disease. And the result is that Parkinson's disease has gone from a very, very rare disorder to one that's a very, very common. In our book, we highlight just how rare Parkinson's disease was. Let me see if I can find the graph. Yeah, and so you can see these are the number of deaths due to Parkinson's disease. Our book has lots of pictures and lots of graphs. And so you can see in 1850, there were almost no deaths due to Parkinson's disease in England. But since that time, the number of people dying from Parkinson's disease has increased and increased almost exponentially. And data from the Global Burden of Disease studies demonstrates that the number of people with Parkinson's disease globally has doubled over the last 25 years. And absent change will at least double again in the coming generation. And as many of you know, Parkinson's disease, although the classic features are the tremor and the slowness of movement and difficulties with walking and speech, the earliest symptoms of the disease are loss of smell and constipation. And this loss of smell and constipation can begin years, if not decades, before the motor features of the disease are present. And these early symptoms correspond to where early pathology of Parkinson's disease is found, and perhaps where Parkinson's disease first begins. So Parkinson's disease may first begin not in the brain in many individuals, but in the nose or in the gut, where many of these environmental factors gain entry. I mentioned that air pollution was a big factor with Parkinson's disease. If you look at maps of Parkinson's disease for the world, areas that are most industrialized have the highest rates of the disease. I think North America and Western Europe. Areas of the world that are least industrialized, like sub-Saharan Africa, have the lowest levels of Parkinson's disease. And areas of the world that are undergoing the most rapid industrialization, like China and India, have the fastest increasing rates of the disease. And this mirrors its way in air pollution, where air pollution first began in Europe, then in North America, and then in Asia, and then in Africa. And that's almost exactly the same pattern that you see for Parkinson's disease. In the late 1940s, World War II, and then the 1950s, synthetic man-made pesticides were introduced, and many of these pesticides are nerve toxins. Many of them target the parts of cells that we know are damaged in Parkinson's disease. Many of them, when fed to laboratory animals, develop the behavioral features of Parkinson's disease. Their paws shake, and they develop the pathological features of Parkinson's disease. And as these pesticides have grown more common, so has Parkinson's disease. One of these particularly offending agents is Paraquat. Anyone know about Paraquat? Anyone know Paraquat? Anyone use Paraquat or grew up near Paraquat? Yeah, so Paraquat was developed in the 1950s, considered the most toxic herbicide ever created, kills the weeds that Roundup doesn't. It's been banned by 32 countries, including China, for public health reasons, but we still permit its use in the United States. This is a map of where Paraquat is used. You can see it's used commonly in the Central Valley of California, but it's also used in Western New York and the Finger Lakes region. It's used, I believe, on corn and apples and corn, I believe, in upstate New York. I'd love to be corrected. If someone knows actually any farmers there, please let me know. Its risk of increasing Parkinson's disease is not 5%, 15%, it's 150%. So if you want to get Parkinson's disease, hang out with Paraquat, because that'll substantially increase your risk of Parkinson's disease. 20 years ago, one of my colleagues at the University of Rochester, Dr. Deborah Corey-Schlechter, demonstrated that when you feed Paraquat to mice, they develop the clinical and pathological features of Parkinson's disease. The EPA has proposed banning Paraquat, and indeed they say that one sip can kill. But in October, just 4 months ago, the EPA reapproved the use of Paraquat despite 100,000 signatures from the Parkinson's community asking for it to be banned. Worse, the use of Paraquat has tripled over the last 25 years, doubled over the last decade, and increased 20% in the last year, for which data are available. Now, I'm just going to read you a brief excerpt from the books, just talking about pesticides in general. This is chapter 4 of the book, and it begins with a quote from Rachel Carson, who wrote the book Silent Spring in 1962, which spawned the modern day environmental movement. She wrote in her book, "The farmers spoke of much illness among their families. In the town, the doctors had become more and more puzzled by new kinds of sickness appearing among their patients." Over the past 40 years, 5 members of Terry McGrath's extended family, including her beloved grandfather, developed Parkinson's disease. In 2005, McGrath, then a 49-year-old special education teacher, noticed that when she walked, her left arm was not swinging and her left foot was dragging. 3 years later, she became the 6th member of her family and the first woman to receive the same diagnosis. In the 1990s, McGrath's grandfather, Alex Adent, and 9 of his brothers and sisters emigrated from Lithuania to the United States. Many of the sisters became seamstresses, and most of the brothers, including McGrath's grandfather, became farmers in southwestern Michigan. Ever since then, McGrath's family life has centered on a farm in St. Joseph, a small town on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan. Her 86-year-old mother spent her entire life within 2 miles of that farm. As a child, McGrath was always playing outside with her grandparents. The family regularly used pesticides on its farm, including DDT, until it was banned in the United States in 1972. When the older family members sprayed the chemicals, McGrath stayed inside because her grandmother did not want her to breathe them in. But McGrath would often slip outside soon after while the pesticides still lingered in the air. She, her siblings, and cousins would all pick apples, currants, and grapes that were covered with a white film. Only after her diagnosis did McGrath learn how dangerous some of these pesticides were and how some were linked to Parkinson's. McGrath loved growing up on that farm. Despite her diagnosis, she says that had she known about the harmful effects of pesticides, she's not certain she would have done anything differently. Her children, who are now all super conscious of what they eat, are surprised that their mother did not think about the risk of pesticides. McGrath says, "I just didn't think about it. I thought farming was fun." My guess is that some of you were engaged in farming and this story resonates. Does this story resonate with some of you? I see Bill and others who share a similar story. And you're not alone. Numerous studies conducted by researchers from around the world have linked pesticides, certain pesticides to Parkinson's disease, linked rural living and well water. 40 million Americans get their water from private wells. How many people drank well water growing up or just still do? No one? Well waters are susceptible to contamination from pesticides from nearby farms, as the pesticides can be washed off and contaminate the groundwater, and people can be unknowingly drinking pesticide contaminated well water often for years. Pesticides are not the only chemical that's been strongly linked to Parkinson's disease. Another chemical called trichloroethylene. Anyone? Trichloroethylene, TCE, maybe a little bit less well known. Widely used in the 1970s. New York Times said it was ubiquitous in the 1970s, used initially in dry cleaning. Then it's an excellent degreasing agent, I'm told, so widely used by mechanics. used in oil processors, printers, numerous consumer products, everything's from whiteout to carpet cleaners to decaffeinating coffee in the 1970s, and contaminates the air we breathe, including the indoor air that we breathe, and contaminates up to 30% of groundwater in the United States. If you live near a TCE contaminated site, it can be disposed of into the ground and form underground plumes that can then evaporate the chemical into your home, into your workplace, or into your school undetected. This is Mr. Danny Fromm, who shortly after graduating high school in Southern California worked in the aerospace industry, where he used TCE to clean electronic circuit boards, where he and his friend worked with the chemical without any protection. He did that for about 8 years. 10 years later, in his 30s, he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. He's since had both medical treatment, levodopa, and deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's disease, and now lives in Idaho with his family. And he says, if you work with this chemical, you should quit your job. I mean, actually, let me get the exact quote. He says, if you're working with it, quit your damn job and get away from it. And so this chemical widely used, there's an Endicott, anyone who lived in Endicott, New York, this was a source of contamination for that community, I believe from an IBM plant in that area. And I'd love to hear stories. If people worked in Endicott, this is how I learn and gather these stories. The TCE contaminates half of Superfund sites in the United States. So Superfund sites are these sites, toxic sites throughout the United States designated by the EPA for cleanup. You can see that there are several of them here in upstate New York, including near where you live and near where I live. In addition to these, there are thousands of other sites, including one I found 15 minutes from my house here in suburban Rochester. And so what happens is that trichloroethylene is a very simple compound. It just has two carbon atoms, 3 chlorine atoms, and 1 hydrogen atom. And it's often inappropriately disposed of. That's a euphemism for just people pouring it into the ground. And they pour it into the ground where it contaminates the underlying soil and then contaminates the groundwater. And this groundwater can migrate and move and then evaporate into buildings, which tend to have negative pressure relative to the ground, and evaporate directly into people's homes and be breathing it without them even knowing it. So I told you there's one place right near where I live called Victor, New York, where this water supply was from freshwater Modoc Springs. And it turned out the New York Department of Environmental Conservation went around testing these freshwater supplies to make sure that they were safe. And lo and behold, they found that the water supply for Modoc Springs for Victor, New York was contaminated with TCE. And that had formed an underground plume. So people were likely exposed to TCE in the water they were drinking, the water they were used for cooking, the water they were using for bathing, and TCE is readily volatile, so it readily evaporates at higher temperatures. And then we're also susceptible to this underground plume in the community. So in addition, we're susceptible to indoor air pollution. And one person we highlight in the book from this area later developed Parkinson's disease. And there are many of these sites. There's 21 of these sites in Silicon Valley alone. And there are in Las Vegas and in Michigan and in upstate New York. This is Jane Horton, who lives across the street from one of these Superfund contaminated sites in Mountain View, California. She lives under one of those sites was contaminated by Intel and Fairchild Semiconductor, which used TCE to clean off silicon wafers. And one of the headquarters for Google is currently built on top of that Superfund site. She read about this in the paper and had the air in her house tested and found to have markedly elevated levels of TCE in her air. And so she had her house cut, butchered, and vented, and had put in this remediation system right outside her electrical utilities box that pumps out air from underneath somebody's home, underneath her home, and releases the TCE contaminated air above her house. So her air, as she says, as she has the cleanest air in all of Mountain View, California. So those are some of the reasons why Parkinson's disease has risen from a very rare disorder 200 years ago to the world's fastest growing brain disease, even faster than Alzheimer's. But we are very optimistic in that if a Parkinson's community gathers around and becomes activated, that we can engage in a pact, PACT, to prevent the disease, advocate for better policies and increase resources for research, to care for everyone affected, and to treat the condition with novel therapies. So what can we do on the prevention front? Well, clearly we need to ban these chemicals that are strongly linked to Parkinson's disease. We also know there are individual behaviors, including vigorous exercise, can decrease your risk of ever developing Parkinson's disease by about 20%. And it's obviously very helpful for people with the disease. I hope all of you with Parkinson's disease are exercising regularly. I know it's much harder to do in the time of COVID. A Mediterranean diet may be beneficial for people with the disease and for those at risk for the disease. I think it goes without saying that if you've had nerve toxins that you want to decrease in Parkinson's, when Parkinson's develops, about 50% of the nerve cells in the part of the brain responsible for controlling movement have since died. You want to protect your remaining 50%. So you want to avoid pesticides that could be linked, that are linked to Parkinson's disease. You want to avoid exposure to other nerve toxins like trichloroethylene. And then you want caffeine has been shown to likely decrease your risk of ever developing Parkinson's disease and may be beneficial for those with the disease. Head trauma, as many of you know, also increases your risk of Parkinson's disease. So you should wear a helmet if you're bicycling or skiing or engaged in similar activities. Second, we need to make our voices heard. In the 1980s, when we were confronted with an unknown virus that was uniformly and rapidly fatal, a group of HIV activists adopted the motto of silence equals death. And for Parkinson's disease, silence doesn't equal death, but it equals needless suffering. And there are 1.1 million Americans with Parkinson's disease, 1.2 million Americans who've been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease living today. 200 more will be diagnosed today. We need to make our voices heard so that for Parkinson's disease, silence equals suffering, in many cases, needless and preventable suffering. And we need to make our voices heard to change the course of this disease. At the same time, the number of Americans with the disease has increased 35%. NIH funding for Parkinson's disease has actually adjusted for inflation, decreased. So number of Americans with the disease going up 35%, NIH funding adjusted for inflation, decreasing. We need to stop that. And we need to change the course. If you look at the economic burden, just the economic burden of Parkinson's disease in the United States is estimated to be about $50 billion per year. And NIH is spending around $200 million a year. So less than 1% of the economic burden of the disease is being spent by the government on research aimed at preventing, measuring, and treating Parkinson's disease. Third, we need to care for everyone affected. So it turns out that 40% of Medicare beneficiaries, I see some likely Medicare beneficiaries participating in this call. 40% of Medicare beneficiaries with Parkinson's disease do not see a neurologist of any kind within 4 years of diagnosis. Not a Parkinson's specialist, not a general neurologist, not a neurologist of any kind. Those individuals who don't see a neurologist are more likely to fracture their hip, more likely to be placed in a skilled nursing facility, and more likely to die. We have the means by which we can connect to people with Parkinson's disease. How many people have used telemedicine in the last year? So lots of you have gained experience with telemedicine. So the changes that Medicare adopted to enable you to receive care via telemedicine in your home are temporary. They are tied to the public health emergency. Absent policy action, they will disappear when the public health emergency passes. We need to make sure these changes are made permanent. So anyone, anywhere, especially those individuals who reside in more rural communities where there are fewer Parkinson's specialists, can continue to receive the care that they need regardless of where they live, which is especially important as the disease progresses and people's driving ability becomes impaired, their mobility becomes impaired, and their need for neurological care actually only increases. Finally, we need more effective treatments for Parkinson's disease. The most effective medication, levodopa for Parkinson's disease, is now over 50 years old. We've had more therapeutic breakthroughs, levodopa and deep brain stimulation in the 20th century than we've had in the 21st century. And although we've had incremental advances and new therapies this century, they really haven't made a big, huge therapeutic breakthrough. And we need better measures of the disease so we can get better treatments faster and more cheaply to more people. With better measures, objective measures of the disease, we can get better treatments faster. With that, I'm just going to stop with a few acknowledgments. First is to my co-authors, Dr. Todd Scher. Many of you know is the CEO of the Michael J. Fox Foundation, who in 2000 conducted groundbreaking work linking a pesticide rotenone to Parkinson's disease and highlighting that many chemicals that target the energy producing parts of cells may be responsible for the majority of cases with Parkinson's disease. Michael Oken is the medical director for the Parkinson's Foundation and the chair of neurology at the University of Florida and a pioneer in surgical treatments for Parkinson's disease, especially deep brain stimulation. And Bastian Bloem is a fellow Parkinson's specialist in the Netherlands, who's developed the world's largest integrated care program for Parkinson's disease called Parkinson Nets. That's widespread in the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and coming to the United States. Lots of people were involved in helping us write the book, including Alistair, who's with us today. Lots of people shared their stories. As I alluded to, as I gave you in that book, the book has lots of stories and a lot of research that's behind the stories, but the reading is the stories and the research is the footnotes. So hopefully it's very readable. You can get the book right now. If you haven't gotten the book, you can get it right now. I'm going to show you where you can get it. Can you still see my screen, Alistair?
Yes, we can.
So you can just go to Amazon and get the book. And if you've, where'd it go? Yeah, perfect. So if you can get the book. If you've read the book, we would love you to review the book, to review on Amazon or whatever website you'd like to do. You just click on ratings here and you click this button that says write a customer review. And these are important because this is the way we get the word out. So you can just say an important book. Please read and hit submit. It can take you 2 minutes to do so. If you can't afford the book, we will send you one for free. All you need to do is just email us at info@endingpd.org. Alistair's going to put that in the chat, info@endingpd.org. If you can't afford the book, we'll send you one for free. All you need to do is just email us and let us know your mailing address so we can mail you a copy. And if you're kind enough to write a review, so much the better. But if you don't even want to write a review, we'll just send you the book for free. All the authors are donating all of our proceeds to efforts to end Parkinson's. I'm donating my efforts to investigate the underlying causes of Parkinson's disease, including a cluster of individuals with Parkinson's disease in the Rochester area. With that, I'm going to stop and see what questions that you guys have.
Thank you, Ray. And we have a brilliant string of questions in the chat to kick us off. So maybe we can start with those and we can think of other questions as we go.
Oh, please discuss genetic mutations. So about 15% of people with Parkinson's disease have a family history of Parkinson's disease, and about 10 to 15% of them have an identifiable genetic risk factor. BRCA1, to my knowledge, is not linked to Parkinson's disease, strongly linked, as many of you know, to breast cancer and ovarian cancer, but not to Parkinson's disease. The most common of these genetic mutations are a mutation in a gene called LRRK2, LRRK2, and GBA. You can participate in a research study that we're helping conduct with the Parkinson's Foundation called PD Generation. I think Alistair will put that link in there to learn more about your genetic risk and get online genetic counseling without having to leave your home. Turns out most of these genetic mutations are insufficient by themselves to develop Parkinson's disease. So even if you have one of these genetic mutations, most likely you won't ever develop Parkinson's disease. But these genetic mutations do increase your risk of Parkinson's disease, and most of them have known interactions with pesticides and other environmental factors tied to the disease. So just like only about 10% of smokers develop lung cancer, only a small portion of farmers or small portion of people exposed to pesticides go on to develop Parkinson's disease. There must be other genetic factors and other environmental factors that are important to determining who goes on to developing those diseases.
Dr. Dorsey?
Running, exercise, you should definitely exercise. So there's strong evidence, pretty good evidence, that vigorous exercise equivalent of 3.5 to 4 hours a week of running or swimming in your 40s, 50s, and 60s can decrease your risk of Parkinson's disease 12 years later by about 20%. We detail all of that in the book. Once a person has Parkinson's, can one eliminate it or be cured? Unfortunately, not today. We have the intervention that might have the most promise for slowing we don't know any intervention right now that slows the progress of the disease. The one that probably has the most benefit, most promise, is probably exercise, which results in producing nerve growth factors that help maintain and grow nerve cells. So again, if you have Parkinson's, I routinely recommend that my patients exercise at least an hour a day. What about Paraquat running off into rivers that are used for drinking water? And so indeed, you don't need to be a farmer using Paraquat, although if you are, that's a high risk. Is that people who live near Paraquat, where it can run off into rivers or contaminate groundwater that's used as people's water supply, are at high risk for developing the disease. Numerous studies have demonstrated, for example, that people who drank well water are at increased risk for the disease. And just like smoking, you don't smoke cigarettes and develop lung cancer the next day. There's a huge lag between it. So these exposures could have happened when you were a child or a teenager or a young adult, and then only manifest themselves later. My friend's parents had Lewy body disease and Parkinson's, and he now has Parkinson's. So, friend's parents. Yeah, so about 15% of cases do run in families. And so some of these genetic mutations are dominant, so would have this kind of inheritance patterns. They tend to be common among Ashkenazi Jews. So if you're an Ashkenazi Jew and you have a family history of Parkinson's disease, both LRRK2 and GBA mutations are more common in Ashkenazi Jewish individuals. Should we only use organic fruit? So, I knew a little bit about pesticides and Parkinson's disease before I wrote this book 2 years ago, but I didn't know as much about it. Didn't know as much about it after I took a sabbatical. And I've changed my health behavior. So I buy a lot more organic produce. I wash all my fruits and vegetables before I eat them. I have a water filter at home to remove, which can help reduce exposure to trichloroethylene. And if I had Parkinson's disease and I had the means, I would probably invest a lot in the diet that I eat and avoid and minimize my exposure to nerve toxins. Can personal water filtration systems eliminate these toxins in well water? Yeah. So if you have a well, you should test it. Unfortunately, most people only test their well water when they buy and sell their home. And that I used to live in Baltimore area, and we tested our well water only when we bought and sold our home, because I didn't know about these risks. And if you are getting water from a well water, water filtration systems like simple carbon filters can help eliminate some, but not all of these toxins. In our book, in the back are some black pages. These pages have resources, and these resource pages give you all the information you can do for testing your water and evaluating pesticides. So for example, we give you the telephone number for the EPA Safe Drinking Water Hotline, and we give you the EPA's website for on private wells, which is just epa.gov/private wells. So these are like all the resources that we provide as part of our prescription for action for people. What sparked your interest in studying this disease? So before I wrote the book, I didn't have any family members affected with it. Actually, since I wrote the book, one of my uncles has been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. I think I liked it initially because it's very clinical. You base your diagnosis based on listening to people like you and examining people like you. And with medications and exercise like levodopa, you can help make people better. Now I have a different view on the disease. When I see someone with Parkinson's disease, I get upset. And the reason I get upset is because I think to a large extent for many individuals, Parkinson's disease is preventable. And, you know, bad things happen to people. You know, one of my sons has congenital heart disease, and, you know, those bad things happen. But when bad things happen that are preventable, I think we look at it in an entirely different context. And I think to a large extent, Parkinson's disease is preventable. I might have more of a bullish view on that than even some of my co-authors and colleagues. And that's what really motivated me to write the book, is that we can turn the tide on these preventable diseases. And if you need examples, think about drunk driving. You know, drunk driving used to be socially acceptable in the 1960s, 70s, and even early 80s. And then mothers whose children had died or were seriously injured in drunk driving formed an organization called MAD in 1980s and changed the course of drunk driving. I don't know if any of you have grandchildren, but you don't need to talk to your grandchildren about drunk driving because they look at it as like, who in the world would drink and drive? It's just completely socially unacceptable. And that change happened because of people like MAD who changed the course of disease. HIV activists changed the course of HIV. A march of dimes changed the course of polio in the 1938 and then led to vaccines in the 1950s. We highlight these stories and others because we think we can change the course of Parkinson's disease. But in order for that course to be changed, it takes a group of devoted activists, usually people most affected by the disease or directly affected by the disease, to make their voices heard to change the course of the disease. And so that's my challenge to you. And the reason we wrote this book, we dedicated it to people who bear the burden and to people who will end Parkinson's disease, is that we need to change the course of the disease. And the only way we can do that is by making our collective voices heard. One person asked that in the book, we highlight that the very few places in the world have decreasing rates of Parkinson's disease. The Netherlands appears to be one of them. And it turns out the Netherlands has been on the forefront of changing their environmental risk exposures. They've banned Paraquat, they've banned Trichloroethylene, they've banned other pesticides linked to Parkinson's disease. Their air quality today is much better than their air quality was 25, 30, or even 40 years ago. And there in the Netherlands, there's one study that suggests that the incidence of Parkinson's, the number of new cases of Parkinson's disease, is actually decreasing, whereas other parts of the world, it seems to be increasing. So some evidence that if we change our behaviors, if we change the course of this, we can prevent people from ever developing this debilitating disease.
Dr. Dorsey,
I'm sorry.
are you taking questions from the floor?
Yeah, sure, I'll take questions.
Thank you for all your good work. 30 years ago, I attended graduate school for graphic arts in Rochester on Elton Street, 4 Elton Street. And we used TCE to clean the silk screens. And it was one of the steps in xerography. We probably maintained maybe 20 gallons in a relatively small space. And we all used it not as cleanly as we should have. 30 years later, I developed Parkinson's, which is now fairly advanced. But there was I suspect it had a significant factor, because I remember hearing of other classmates who subsequently came down with Parkinson's as a result of that exposure. So that's one in Rochester for you.
Yeah, were you, David, will you shoot me an email at info@endingpd.org? That way we can look into this a little bit more.
I will.
And then, so there was one study that looked at twins who were exposed to TCE in a work exposure and twins who were unexposed. And the risk of Parkinson's among the exposed twins wasn't 5% higher or 15 or 50%, but 500% higher. Nothing like gives you a 500% increased risk of developing a disease, but TCE does that for Parkinson's. So I'd be concerned. And we have a whole chapter 5 of the book highlights people like you who got Parkinson's disease potentially due to their TCE exposure.
Do you believe that the adjacent treatments like amantadine or parapenplexylate have a significant impact in the therapeutics area?
You said amantadine. What was the second one? Pramipexole.
No.
So those medicines have been studied and are beneficial for people with Parkinson's disease. All medicines have their side effects. Amantadine can cause hallucinations and cognitive dysfunction. Pramipexole and that whole class of medicines causes impulse control disorder. So compulsive gambling, sexual behavior, eating, and shopping. So you got to be really, 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 really vigilant about that. You know, I've had numerous individuals who developed those. Even when I've started and I've told them about it, they still have the problems. You know, we've even had priests, you know, developing problems with the medicine. So I use them very judiciously and very, very, very carefully. Quite frankly, I don't use Prairie Paxol very much at all because of that reason.
Thank you very much.
Warren, do you have a question there? I can't hear you, Warren. If you unmute yourself, that would be great. While Warren comes on, washing food. So I wash fruits and vegetables with water and a little bit of soap. That way you get rid of the fat-soluble pesticides and water.
Warren, we still can't hear you. If there should be a button to unmute yourself.
Dentists, I'm not sure about why dentists might be at higher risk. You know, obviously exposed to lots of different chemicals, but I don't know. Trichloroethylene used to be used as an anesthetic until the FDA banned it in the 1970s. I don't think it was used as an anesthetic by dentists, but that's one thought. Some of the heavy metals that dentists use could also be linked to Parkinson. While we try to get Warren, other questions, if you raise your hand, or Alistair or I will, there you go. Annie, there you go. Go ahead, Annie.
Roy. Thank you. What about ECT treatments for depression and Parkinson's disease?
You know, so ECT can be electroconvulsive therapy, essentially giving people seizures, can be a treatment for refractory depression, so depression that does not respond well to medications. And depression can be common in Parkinson's. We think it's part of the disease itself, not a reaction to the disease per se, but part of the disease itself, the parts of the brain that are responsible for controlling mood are affected. There have been a few studies of ECT in Parkinson's disease where some people have found a little bit improvement in motor features. I've never used it. I think it wouldn't be like, it certainly would be on the experimental realm.
And I think we have Warren.
Warren, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I worked for 35 years in the Upper East Side of Manhattan on the 28th floor. And I wondered if there was any electrical, mechanical pollution that could be associated with Parkinson's. I was diagnosed 3 years ago. One of my predecessors in the same office about 8 years ago, and his predecessor about 15 years ago. All in the same very small area near elevator and telecommunications equipment.
Yeah, so again, shoot me an email and like provide me some additional details so we can take a deeper dive. So we're investigating a cluster of Parkinson's in Rochester, New York, who used to work in a building. The concern there would be the chemical TCE. So TCE, as I said, can form these underground plumes. And what happens with elevator shafts is the elevator acts as a syringe. So just like, you know, if you're drawing up water into a syringe, you just lift the plunger and the elevator lifts the plunger and can pull in TCE into office buildings and expose people to it. Now, the question is there TCE near, was there a TCE near where you worked, or was there like a dry cleaners that was there antecedent before the building was built and contaminated the soil on which the building was built? But those are the types of things that come to my mind when I hear those stories.
Dr. Dorsey?
Yes.
How much agreement or disagreement in the scientific community is there about these ideas on chemicals and Parkinson's?
I think the pesticide things is well established. That's been 20 plus years of researchers, the United States, Canada, France, just about every part of the world. And these pesticides are nerve toxins. As I told you, they target the parts of cells that we know are damaged. There's just really not much about it. We don't know what portion of Parkinson's disease is due to these pesticide exposures, but that's, I think the vast majority of us are really quite comfortable that pesticides are contributing to it. The TCE story is much less well known. I didn't really know about it at all. I'm not even sure I knew what trichloroethylene was until I started reading the literature. I think it's becoming increasingly aware. It's worth knowing that TCE and these pesticides all target a part of the energy producing cells called mitochondria, which you might have learned about in high school biology. And they target the parts of the energy producing cell where they generate lots of ATP. And so these toxins, TCE and certain pesticides, all target the same parts of cells that we know are damaged in Parkinson's disease. So there's it can form a congruence in terms of their mechanism of likely injury. One of the chief problems is we don't have a great way of measuring exposure to pesticides. So I can't not easily can I measure your blood and see how much pesticide you've been exposed to, or even harder if you've been exposed to TCE, as the case Warren was being indicated. And that's what we're actually spending our proceeds and fundraising for, is to investigate a cluster very much like Warren identified. Air pollution, there have been some studies, but as you can imagine, you can't randomize people to get exposed to Paraquat and not exposed to Paraquat and then follow them for 60 years to see who develops Parkinson's. I mean, those studies just aren't feasible. It's the same thing. You can't do that for smoking and lung cancer, but you can look at epidemiological evidence and you can look at animal models. You can look at the strength of the relationship. You can see, is there a dose response relationship? The more exposure you are, the more likely you are to develop the disease. And when you look at all those factors, they're all very consistent or very concerning for their roles.
Great, thank you very much.
And we had a question from Patricia in the chat as well about equity of healthcare delivery and how do we reach communities that are medically underserved when it comes, I suppose, specifically to Parkinson's care, and especially when it comes to a minority of communities that may have suspicion as well around healthcare delivery.
Yeah, so we haven't figured that out. It's a huge issue. Dr. Allison Willis, who wrote the paper showing that 40% of Medicare beneficiaries with Parkinson's disease don't see a neurologist, found that the people who were least likely to get care were older, were women. So women take care of their husbands, but maybe their husbands don't take as good care of the women, and minority groups, especially African Americans. So we need to get better ways to do that. Quite frankly, people like me need to be more trustworthy. Researchers like me don't have a great record of being trustworthy when it comes to African Americans and other populations. And so we need to demonstrate our trustworthiness. And I think we need to deliver care to people on their terms. We try to do that via telemedicine. As some of you know, that we've been using telemedicine since 2007 to care initially for people in nursing homes. But we also need to go into people's communities and meet them where they are instead of expecting that patients come meet us where we are. That's kind of backwards. It should be healthy doctors should be seeing sick patients on their terms instead of the other way around. The Brown family.
Hi. So you said this is a disease that is preventable. So I did, in fact, in the chat ask if it's preventable. So the cause, why can't it be reversed? Why can't people be cured of it?
So I said to a large extent, it may be preventable, but so just like smoking, obviously a preventable cause of lung cancer, but once you get the lung cancer, it's really, 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 really hard to undo the damage. It's really, really, really hard to undo the damage of a car accident. It's really, 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 really hard to undo the damage of breast cancer. So the reason we wrote this book and put this pact, and the first layer of the pact is to prevent the disease, is because it's much easier to prevent somebody from ever getting lung cancer. It's much easier to prevent someone from ever getting hurt in a car accident or having drunk drivers on the road than it is to treat them after the fact. And if you need any better evidence, look at COVID-19. We don't have any cures for COVID-19, but we have vaccines that are highly effective at preventing the disease. And the way I think we'll end this pandemic is not by curing everyone with the disease, but by preventing people from ever getting the disease in the first place. And so what I'm saying is the first response to any pandemic, any crisis, whether it's an infectious virus or a fire, is to contain it. It's to prevent other people from becoming affected by the disease. Then once you've contained it and you prevent other people from being exposed to like the nuclear waste or whatever it is, then you go help the people who've been affected. And right now we have failed to contain Parkinson's disease. It continues to rise. More of your friends and family members become affected by the disease every year. You see more and more people on the streets or in your houses of worship or in the airports, or you get more calls from family members and friends with the disease. We need to stop it. Yes.
So once you have it, is deterioration inevitable?
You know, as far as we know, now I hedge because, you know, how do we measure deterioration? You know, we have you do this, you know, and do this, and you get worse over time. I don't have a good way of measuring the number of nerve cells in your brain with Parkinson's disease. If I did that, I could tell you if it's getting worse, but the evidence that we have to date suggests that yes, in 2021, Parkinson's disease is a progressive neurodegenerative condition for which we currently can't slow the rate of the progression. That said, I would do things that would avoid worsening the rate of progression by avoiding nerve toxins. I would exercise, which may be able to change the course of the disease. And I would take highly effective medications like levodopa to provide symptomatic relief.
And I would add
Thank
one
you.
very brief thing, which is to say that participating in research studies is crucially important, and research studies are ultimately how we are going to develop and test the treatments that will or may eventually be able to slow progression of this disease. And so participating in your local, any research opportunities that are interesting that come your way. And I'll put in a little plug here as well. We have a study interest registry for anyone anywhere in the US or globally who's interested in participating in research studies. We coordinate a number of them, and I'll put that link in the chat to sign up. It's 3 short online forms.
Other questions? I got them all. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Natalie, very much for organizing it. Again, the way, and you guys are in New York City, you know, it was ACT UP, which is an HIV activist group formed by the late Larry Kramer, a playwright who recently died in New York City. And again, their motto was silence equals death. And the span of 16 years, they took HIV from a uniformly rapidly fatal disease to one that was eminently treatable with the development of protease inhibitors and associated with a near normal life expectancy. So in the span of 16 years, when brave people made their voices heard, they took what was a progressive, uniformly fatal disease and turned it into one that was associated with a near normal life expectancy. And in the process, prevented thousands, if not millions, including many of us, from ever developing HIV by changing our sexual practices and preventing the spread of HIV. So there are great examples in your own backyard about how the way we can change the course of the disease. We need to apply those lessons to Parkinson's disease. And we're going to be starting a campaign and hope to engage all of you in it about giving a dime about Parkinson's disease, to take some of that activism that we saw from the March of Dimes to end polio and do that to help prevent and end Parkinson's disease. Thank you very much.
And to follow up on that, hold your calendars for March the 16th. More details to follow. And Patricia, if it's okay with you, I'll send you an email once we have those details and that sign up live, and you can send to this group. We'd love to see everybody who's here today on a event midday on March 16th. Details to follow.
Thank you.
Thank you very
all
much.
Could you
Dr.
repeat
Dorsey,
the-
thank you.
Thank you. Please email me. I'd love to learn your stories and learn more. We try to respond to everything we hear from info@endingpd.org.
Thank you.
Info
Thank
at
you.
ending.
Would you say that again? What's the
Yes.
site?
Info@endingpd.org. So just info
Okay.
at endingpd.org.
Yeah,
And I just put it in the chat, and I'm sure Natalie will be happy to share it with everyone else if you can't figure out the chat.
thank you.
Yes, I'll send that out to the group. And
Great.
Mesa, thank you for all your help, who's on here too. Dr. Ray Dorsey, this was a wonderful hour. We appreciate all this wonderful information. Alistair, thank you. Nice to meet you. And yes, let's stay connected. And so looking forward to, future updates, collaboration, getting more answers. And Pat Beilman, who I know is on here, thank you for making this connection happen and suggesting the book in the first place. So take care, everybody. I wish you all a pleasant rest of the day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.